Welcome to the Oral History Podcast, featuring stories from the oral history website voicesofoklahoma.com, where Oklahomans have given generously of their time to tell their life stories for present-day listeners and for generations to come. Our entire collection is available on the website voicesofoklahoma.com. Subscribe to be notified of new Oklahoma oral history podcasts. Here's another interesting storyteller from voicesofoklahoma.com. Ross Swimmer's Native American heritage and work in real estate law intersected when he performed pro bono work for the Cherokee Nation Housing Authority, and he later became in-house counsel for the Cherokee Nation. Ross began working for the nation in an official capacity in 1972 and became principal chief in 1975. He remained principal chief until 1983, when he left at the request of President Ronald Reagan to serve as Assistant Secretary of the Interior, Indian Affairs. Swimmer was instrumental in helping Western tribes secure water rights and providing funds for projects that allowed tribes to use that water for agricultural and business projects on reservations. Swimmer served as president of Cherokee Nation Industries Incorporated before being asked by President George W. Bush and Secretary of the Interior Gail Norton to return to Washington as the director of the Indian Trust Transition at the Department of the Interior. In 2003, President Bush nominated Swimmer to become the Special Trustee for American Indians, an appointment requiring Senate approval. Now you can hear Ross tell his interesting story on the podcast and website, voicesofoklahoma.com.
My name is John Erling. Today's date is June 27, 2018. Ross, would you state your full name, please?
Ross Owen Swimmer.
Are you named after someone in particular?
Swimmer is a Cherokee name that was given to me, of course, from my dad, who was half Cherokee. In Cherokee, it's translated as Adowuski. Swimmer name was very popular in the 1800s. One of the swimmers was known for writing a book on medicine, the Cherokees and herbal solutions, things like that. But as far as I know, it is just the name from the Cherokee.
And Ross, was that after someone?
Well, I was told by Dad that it was after John Ross. Now I don't have any knowledge that I'm in that line from the Ross family. It's pretty broad, even though John Ross, of course, was only an 8th Cherokee, but he had married into the Cherokee Nation with other, like Quady, his first wife, was full-blood Cherokee, and they had children and then had other siblings. But as far as I know, that was where the name Ross came from.
Yeah. Your date of birth?
October 26, 1943.
So that makes your present age?
74.
And where are we recording this interview?
Tulsa, Oklahoma, at my home in Tulsa, where Margaret and I reside.
And where were you born?
Oklahoma City.
Let's talk about your mother, her maiden name and where she came from and what she did.
Mother was Virginia, and her last name was Pounder. She was all English, and her family came from Leeds, England, town north of London. She grew up in Oklahoma City. Her family, her mother and her sister lived in Oklahoma City when I was a very young person. We spent a great deal of time with them. Other than that, I don't know much about her. Mother was, she's an interesting lady. She worked for the Federal Aviation Agency for a long time. And eventually, when she was about 60, she went to law school. She was doing the work of a lawyer at the FAA in Oklahoma City, but she couldn't be paid for it because she didn't have a degree. So she went to Oklahoma City University Law School, was graduated, able to continue. She continued working for another 4 or 5 years. Her main job there was to register aircraft. Every airplane in the United States has to go through FAA in Oklahoma City. At one point, she was one of these government workers that felt like it was her job to get things done instead of find reasons not to. One time I heard the story about Braniff Airlines. They had wanted to register a new airliner. Mother was not available at that time to do it, and they said, well, we will wait until she comes back, because they didn't want they knew that they would get the job done with her there. I think she was on the first flight of the supersonic airplane that went from here to Europe when they developed that. That doesn't run anymore, but that first, I forget what they called it now, but it was one of those supersonic. She was a very good mother, probably why the three of us survived and did well. They were divorced when we went to college, and I think it was my first, I think it was freshman year when I was in college, and they got a divorce. And it's one of those things where I think they stayed married for the kids, because Dad was an alcoholic. He was an attorney and did reasonably well in Oklahoma City.
And his name?
Robert Otis Swimmer. He practiced law in Oklahoma City, did a lot of criminal practice. He represented a lot of the bootleggers around town to keep everybody in business with their liquor. But he developed the alcoholism. I don't know how long he'd had it, but I know ever since we were very small children that he exhibited all of the signs of alcoholism. And that created a lot of problems for him and for the family over the years.
And how many children then are in the family?
Well, the three of us, I have two sisters, Virginia Lassiter, Argyle, Texas, and Patricia Lazenby, who resides at Salt Spring Island in British Columbia. I have Dad remarried after Mom and Dad were divorced, and he had two more children. Married Betsy Swimmer from Pryor, Oklahoma, who is also a Cherokee. I have a half-brother, John, who resides, I believe, in Minnesota, and Lisa Swimmer, who lives here in Tulsa. He was married the first time before to my mother, and I had a half-brother, Robert Eugene Swimmer. He was kind of a role model. He was one of these guys that he was 10 or 12 years older than I was growing up. He was a big guy. He was about 6 foot, about 6'8", about 250 pounds, always worked out. He went to California to get into the movies, and he played a few bit roles and things like Rawhide and Gunsmoke and some other shows out there.
And what was his name again?
Robert Eugene. We called him Gene, Eugene Swimmer. He made a living in real estate out there, helped develop the La Costa resort area of Southern California. He was killed in a plane crash. He was showing property, and they had taken a group of people up to an area on one of these old DC 4 or 5 planes. When they were coming back, apparently the pilot failed to take the gust locks off of the tail. And so when they tried to take off, it went straight into the ocean. That was 40 years ago, maybe.
How did your mother influence your life? How did she encourage you?
It was a series of things. I think she was sort of the, hard to describe, she was the calm person. She was the one that held it all together. You know, if Dad was if he was out drunk or something, or threatening, which he did, she would always be protective and make sure that we were taken care of. She was the mother that would always come to the school plays and encourage all of us, all three of us, to just do our best.
And to pursue education, obviously.
And to pursue education. We didn't even think about that. I mean, it's a little different because back then, when you think about college, it was just assumed we would go to OU. There wasn't much discussion about it. So, and that you would go to college. I mean, that wasn't an issue. We graduated Putnam City High School, had actually grown up in the Yukon school district and attended Yukon from I was there from second grade all the way through the 10th grade. We lived out at Lake Overhoser on the north side of the lake and on a 5-acre kind of ranch. We called it the Worm Ranch because Dad wanted to do something to make sure we had our time occupied. He came up with the idea of raising worms, and we raised worms, and we sold worms internationally. It was a real industry back then. And of course we were at Lake Overhoser, and so we had all the bait dealers, and we kids would go out and harvest the worms and take them around and sell them. And that was a good experience. I can't complain about it. I did then, but I don't now.
Right. And then, so your father was, despite the fact that he was an alcoholic and it was tough to be around him, I'm sure, when he was drinking.
Sure.
He was a big influence on your life.
Well, in that respect, he was. He didn't pay much attention to what we did as far as schoolwork and that kind of thing. That was, Mother was always there. It was good for us because we worked. We started, working when we were 10 years old, doing things out there on the acreage, keeping it up, and then being able to actually learn a little bit of business through the sale of the worms. And we raised livestock. I mean, had chickens and what have you, geese and all, and we had truck garden, and we would harvest the goods from that and take them and sell them. And so it was an experience for us. It was very good as we were growing up.
Right.
And learning to deal with people.
Here's the follow-up question to do on your father.
Mm-hmm.
Because of his alcoholism, did that make you sensitive to that issue of alcohol as you grew up and got older and realized others had a drinking problem and all that?
Very much so. I was very worried about getting the disease and very reluctant to drink. I never drank during high school. It always is in the back of my mind that, what if, I can't stop? Because just growing up with someone like that, he could be sober for a year, but then he'd take that drink, and that would, you'd go for the 2 or 3 years and unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for him, he was the kind of alcoholic who could do some pretty bad things, and the next morning he would deny. He had no recollection.
Blackout.
Just a blackout.
Right.
I remember one instance, he and I went fishing. We lived, as I said, by Overhoser, and there was a area around us where you could, besides the lake, where you go fishing. And I remember he had taken a 6-pack of beer, and we drove to it, and I was worried about him driving. And I think I drank 2 or 3 of the beers so I could keep him from drinking it.
Oh.
And that's probably the first time I had anything. But I've been fortunate. I haven't developed any great craving for alcohol. I have a drink every now and then, and no big deal.
Yeah.
My younger sister didn't fare so well. She's had alcohol She recently went through a serious brain injury. She had a fall, and I suspect it's related to her drinking. It's been in a rehab or hospital-type nursing home for almost 9 months. She's now getting much better up in British Columbia, but she's the one in the family that it fell to, apparently.
Did your father become sober before his death?
I don't think so. He died, he basically had nothing. Once he got remarried and had the 2 children, he and Betsy got a divorce. He went to work for Legal Aid as an attorney over in Muskogee. I'm really not sure what else he did. He came to me after I was elected chief, and he wanted me to hire him in the tribe, and I told him I couldn't do that.
Why?
Well, I wouldn't do it simply because he's my father, and second, we did have a nepotism policy, so I couldn't legally do it. I could have found something, I'm sure, but it wouldn't have been good because he was not had no further ability to do anything constructive. Found out that he was basically, Betsy had pretty much thrown him out of the house, and he had no place to go, so my older sister and I went over to Locust Grove. He had a half-sister that was full-blood, and she was a great person, and she would take care of him when a lot of times if he had an episode or something, he'd go over there and she would take care of him. And then I have a cousin, Meredith, swimmer, that's now Meredith Fraley. Meredith's now a county commissioner over in Mays County. She was on the tribal council, and she ran for chief, actually, 2 terms ago. So anyway, we found out that Dad was basically homeless, so we went up to Locust Grove and got him a place to live, and then I got a call a couple of months later that he died. He went to Hastings Hospital in Tahlequah, and he had died.
How old was he?
Gosh, I think he was about 70, maybe 72, 73. But he'd had cancer. He had stomach cancer. He had some heart trouble. Obviously, the alcohol was debilitating. I mean, he had all kinds of things wrong with him, but the poor guy just, I really attribute it to alcohol as much as anything, but he just couldn't.
And as we trace your life and professional life, he's involved in that. So he was an accomplished person on one hand, and then he had these problems on the other. So as you reflect on him, how do you view him then? You certainly must respect some of the things that he did professionally.
Well, yeah, and you know, aside from problems with alcohol and all, he was a decent guy. Part of why I think I decided to go to law school, I had thought seriously about med school, and I decided after taking a couple of advanced chemistry courses that I should be doing something else. And I think because he was practicing law in Oklahoma City, I said, well, that sounds good. I think I'll go ahead and go into the legal field. And that's probably as much as anything what gave me the idea to go to law school. You know, those are the kinds of things you can look at and say it's good or it's bad. Wish it hadn't been that way, or it was just a terrible situation. It was all an experience, and it's all life's experience, and you take out of it, hopefully, the best parts of it, and you say it wasn't all bad. There were a lot of good things that went on, and even, as I said, even with the alcohol, it was a situation that gave me pause as to what I should do later on as far as taking a drink and whether I could or not. And I think all three of us realized it was more of a disease than anything else. It wasn't intentional. He just absolutely couldn't stop.
Alcoholism runs in all races. So fair or unfair, we sometimes hear that Native Americans have that gene more than others. Mm-hmm. Is that an unfair?
No, I think that I think it very probably could be genetic. I just have to believe that because the incidence of it is so high with American Indians that there could be a genetic issue involved.
You spoke about your half-brother as being 6'5", 7',
6'8".
You're tall yourself. How tall are you?
6'4".
Okay. But when you were, what kind of a person were you when you attended Putnam Heights Elementary School? I think you were kind of a shy guy, weren't you?
Yes.
Very shy.
Yes.
And how long, and then you attended school in Yukon, as you've said. Mm-hmm. You went on to junior high school. Somewhere along the line, that shyness went away, or you started overcoming by getting involved. Talk to us about that.
It didn't go away very, very quickly. It went away about the time I decided to run for chief, and I was 30 years old. The anecdote that everybody talks about is our first grade teacher at Putnam Heights was also our godmother. Very wonderful person, Frances Barrett. And Frances sent a note home one day to my parents and said, I want you to have Ross's hearing tested, because I will know then if he isn't hearing me or if he isn't paying attention. Because I would sit in class and just kind of put my head down and not do anything, not be responsive. And so she said, once I know what it is, I'll know how to deal with it. So she helped me a lot just in the first grade to overcome some of that. But and I don't know necessarily where it came from, unless it's genetic as well. But they're shy people, they're outgoing people. I don't know that you develop a personality that you have that much control over it. I did. I certainly overcame some. Part of it, I also started playing the clarinet because Gene did, my older brother, my half-brother. He was quite accomplished, and I thought I'd like to do something, so I wanted to play the clarinet. And at UConn, I started in the band there, took lessons, and Mother bought me a clarinet, and we were able to learn how to play it, and I did fairly well and rose up in the ranks of UConn, and then went to Putnam City, which our graduating class at UConn was like 35 or 40, and our graduating class at Putnam City was, I think, 1,200. So it was an enormous jump from a small rural school into a school like Putnam City. And that probably also pushed me a little bit to overcome some of that shyness that I had exhibited.
You got very involved. You got involved in Latin Club?
Latin Club. I loved Latin, took it. And,
school plays, scholastic meets, member of the Honor Society. I mean, you were getting really social, and some of that shyness was still with you.
Yeah, it still was. I just forced myself to do things because I thought it would be good to do it. I played the clarinet solo at graduation, and still think back about that and think, how could I have done that? I know I would go to competition, music competition, playing the clarinet, and I'd be so nervous I could hardly play. And I thought, I got to overcome this some way. And I just kept pushing to try to overcome that so I could play. And like I say, when I played the solo at the graduation, it seemed to go okay. Then headed down to OU
And so you graduated from Putnam City High School in what year?
1961.
Okay. Here you are, 74 years old. Do you feel you still have some of that shyness in you?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And it's been a liability. I'm not comfortable just going out and meeting people for business or any other reason. I tend to pull back, and I need to overcome that, and I continually work on it. In a lot of ways, people assume you're aloof, that you're not interested in them, and that's not it at all. It's a personality thing of trying to be more outgoing, and it does make a big difference. I've just never been real gregarious with people, and fortunately, marrying Margaret helped a lot.
Because she was outgoing.
She's very outgoing. She will meet somebody, and before she's through talking, she'll know who the kids are and where their last trip was, and then 2 years from now, she'll meet them and say, "Oh, you were going to take that trip last time," photographic memory. And I've got a terrible memory, and that is one of the things I think is the biggest liability of a political person, not to be able to remember people's names. That is an asset that goes so far. And I know, people will come up to me and we'll get to talking, and I have no idea who they are.
Yeah.
And you just develop, you try to develop a mechanism to do that without them realizing you don't know who you're talking to, or you can't remember the name. I think that's a liability. I think that's a liability for anyone. There are ways, you try these tricks of the trade to overcome it, and it works a lot of the time, but there's still, it's the shyness, but it's also the memory. I think that's part of it. A big part of it is if you don't have the ability to remember all those details, and especially people's names, makes a big difference. And I've experienced that in the political world.
And everybody who's listening to this knows what you've accomplished, and probably surprised to hear you talking like this. So would you say you have a reclusive nature to you?
Yes.
And rather than go to that big house next door and see all these people, you'd rather sit here.
Read the newspaper.
Read the newspaper, right. So that's in you. But obviously you pushed through that, as we will find out here. So you went to the University of Oklahoma. You practiced law out of the University of Oklahoma in Oklahoma City.
Yes.
And I think that was from 1967 to about 72.
Yes.
And so what law firm did you work for?
The firm's name was Hanson, Tumulty, Fisher, Peterson, and Tompkins, and did practice real estate law. We represented a mortgage company there and did closings. And then what moved my career as such further was that about that time, with the Great Society programs coming into being, the Housing and Urban Development Cabinet was formed, and they started providing funds to build low-income housing. And all the developers were wanting to get into that. And I thought that would be a good area from the legal point of view to get into, and it was. Because Indian land titles in Oklahoma are some of the worst kinds of titles you would find anywhere, due to the allotment process in '06 and following through with the 5 tribes. Particularly difficult, because if you were full blood, your allotment was restricted and held in trust by the government. and managed by the government, by the BIA. If you were less than a half degree of blood, you got your land free and clear. You could go out the courtroom the next day and sell it. But when you go back and look at the title, you have to be sure that if the land was sold, that that person was what degree of blood they were on the roll. And then you go through quiet title and all that. So anyway, I met with Keeler and I offered to volunteer a day a week to go over to Tahlequah, to drive over and work with the housing authority to try to straighten this out or help them. They had attorneys in Tulsa that were working for them, but I thought it would be something to, to help the tribe and get more involved. And of course, one thing led to another, and I did get more involved.
Right, and so Bill Keeler was the chief then of the Cherokee Nation. You did that for some time, and then didn't you become then an attorney for the Cherokee Nation House Counsel?
I did. I worked for the Housing Authority for a couple of years, 72 and 73. Second half of 72, I guess, when we went to Tahlequah and was hired by the Housing Authority. And I worked for them. The Housing Authority was still a separate agency, although it was it's like a city housing authority. It was licensed under the tribe, but it worked independently. There were issues between the tribe and the housing authority. And at one point, I found myself writing letters back and forth to myself. And I said, this isn't going to work. And I told tribal people in the housing authority that I needed to do one or the other. I either need to work in the housing authority or work at the tribe. And I said, I'd love to go to work for the tribe. In 73, I went in as in-house counsel. Earl Boyd Pierce of Fort Gibson was our general counsel, and had been, he and Andy Wilcoxon of Muskogee had done the legal work of the tribe for years and years. The legal work being mainly suing the government for claims that the tribe had against the government. But we were just gearing up. The Cherokee Nation was still a very small entity. We had very little to do. The social programs were just beginning to come into play in Indian country in Oklahoma. But there were issues that were developing, and they needed to have legal counsel in-house. So I got hired, worked for the tribe. So Keeler and the other chiefs, leaders decided they would have an election. They did in 71. Then we were ready for one in 75. Keeler calls me in and he says, we've got to do something about the next principal chief. Who do you think ought to be these people running? Who do you think should be our candidate? And I said, well, Bill, I don't know. I don't think any of them. I mean, we had the usual guys, preachers and this and that. I said, I really don't know. And I said, what do you think? And he said, well, I agree with you. There's nobody in that group that can do the job, but I do know somebody. And I said, well, that's great. Who is it? And he said, I'm sitting across from him, and I want you to run. And he offered, I think he gave me $5,000 to help support the candidacy. So I go home and tell Margaret that I'm going to run for chief, and she says, you're out of your mind.
Did you commit to him there in that initial meeting, that you would run?
Yeah. I told
here's Mr. Shy Guy.
Mr. Shy Guy, and I thought, I don't know what I'm doing. I said, I'll put my name out there. And the one thing I'd done at the Housing Authority, I spent practically every night going out to the communities to explain the housing issues and what these people were getting or could get and how to do it at various community meetings and things around the 14 counties. And that was, a real benefit because lots of people didn't know who I was, besides just being the tribal lawyer. So I agreed, and Margaret could tell you the story. She said, I came home and said, I'm going to run. And she said, she waited a couple of days, and I'd go sit in the living room and read the newspaper. She said, she came in and said, if you're going to run, you better get your butt out there and start working. And I said, well, what am I supposed to do? She said, we got to put a campaign together. And she was the one that organized it. She put the whole campaign together. She got all of her friends, most of them were Cherokee. Gary Chapman was a dear friend, still is, still alive, barely. Susie, his daughter, and we collected people around the dining room table and started, figuring out how to run a campaign and mail out letters, stuff envelopes. We did it all by hand. We didn't have any fancy mail centers or anything. And then I started campaigning, and I would write a speech, and I would go to a community meeting, and I would get up and I would carefully read my speech. And Margaret said, that ain't gonna work. She said, you got to connect with the people, and you know what you want to do. You know what the tribe needs right now, and all kinds of issues. And the big issue then was that I would bring a constitution forward for the people to sign and get a tribal government, deputy chief and a council and a court, so we could be a full-fledged government. And that was my campaign issue, as well as a few other things. And she said, that's what you just need to get up and talk to people and tell them. And so after a month or so, I threw away the written speeches, and I just forced myself to get up and start talking. It kind of worked.
Yeah. And you were only 30 years old at the time.
I was 30 years old.
Would you be the youngest chief ever?
Well, I guess so. I don't know all of them, but I think so, based on the ones that I'm acquainted with, going back to the mid-1800s.
So you won that election. Was that because, but people did know you, were you the only candidate who set up, I want to set up a constitution? Was that your platform?
That was mine. Others agreed. Others were running with that idea too, but I don't think most of them knew what they were talking about. The interesting thing about that election was that there was an attempt to keep me from running. And the group that I talked about that was doing some things with the tribe that I thought were not good, they were also writing the election rules that Keeler would have to sign off. Well, in 71, when he ran, they had set the age limit at 30 to be chief. Keeler was out in Tennessee. By this time, he was, he was ready to retire from Phillips, and he was doing stuff on his own and looking for gas or something out in Tennessee. So this group of folks that were my opposition was mainly within the Cherokee government or the administration. They sent out revised rules to Keeler, and the age limit had been moved to 35. So Keeler comes back to town, and I meet with him, and I said, well, Bill, you just wrote me out of the election. He said, well, that didn't happen. I haven't done anything. I said, well, you signed the rules. He didn't read them. He just signed off on them, sent them back. He said, well, that's not going to happen. So he gets the rules and strikes through it and puts it back at 30, which he had the authority to do. The other rule, which was to my benefit, was that it was the high vote wins, no runoff. And as best I recall, and you could look up the record of it, I got maybe 28% of the vote out of 10 candidates. The next highest was about 18, and then 16, and then, half a dozen here and there. And so with the plurality of the vote, I got elected. And there were anti-Keeler people for some reason. I wish I could remember more. We had a lot of protest. I mean, it was bitter. Of course, some of it was I was also a banker at that time. We were the Bank of the Cherokees. Our bank, before I ever joined it, was a bank that kept them alive. And even while I was there, it was having to pay the overdrafts and keep the tribe in business. But the opposition I had, and Keeler had too, was it wasn't because they were necessarily supporting someone else. We just either weren't Cherokee enough, or we were business people. But I remember at the inauguration, Andy Wilcoxon was the master of ceremonies, and one lady from a little town north of Tahlequah, she had this placard, this anti-swimmer placard, and kept waving it at everybody. Andy leaned over we were out on the grounds in Tahlequah, the courthouse or Capitol building, and he handed her a $1 bill and said, why don't you go buy a lemon? You're just so sour about everything. She just wanted to interrupt and what have you. But it was a tough election and in large part because we had 10 people running. Everybody had their favorite candidates.
So you were half Cherokee.
I'm a quarter. Dad was a half.
He was a half.
Granddad was a full. So it go right down. Each one was intermarried.
And so they were saying you weren't Cherokee enough because you were a quarter.
Right. That was a minor issue. There were others, I think, that mainly around the business at the tribe, and people were upset about cleaning house and getting other things done. And I just can't remember why they were so vitriolic, but it really was. I mean, that was a tough situation.
Just a couple of issues. As you were elected the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, you helped improve economic development. Casinos, when did that become a part of economic development?
Well, of course, casinos in Indian country began back in the early 80s. With court decisions, and much of what's happened in Indian country over the years has been accomplished through court decisions, not through legislation. Congress doesn't want to deal with Indians; they never have, and as a result, the American Indian has suffered for generations and still does. I mean, we have the most pathetic problems out in Indian country. I call North, South Dakota, eastern Washington, Montana, parts of Arizona, New Mexico. I mean, people are living out there in horrible conditions and have been for 100 years.
We're calling it reservations.
Reservations.
Yeah.
We're so fortunate in Oklahoma not to have reservations, but brings up a question is whether we even really have tribes in Oklahoma. We're so assimilated. But we do have tribes. So gaming came into being in the early 80s, and tribes in Florida and out west started this trend. And it first started with bingo. That was legal. Church plays bingo, so everybody can play bingo, and nobody got too objectionable about that. The council and I were talking about that. I left in October 1985, and the last action I took as chief was to veto a bill from the council to permit gaming. I said, I don't think this is the wisest thing to do for the tribe. We had a couple of companies. We had a plant nursery. We had Cherokee Nation Industries that was doing quite well. And I said, we can develop businesses and create jobs over here without getting into gambling. And I said, I just don't see that as the best thing for the tribe to do. Well, it wasn't but a few months after I left that they brought it back up again, and Wilma signed off on it, and so the rest is history. They built a bingo hall out where the Hard Rock is, and they grew it into, as case law allowed tribes to get into all sorts of gaming, what they have now. And it's hard to deny that it hasn't been, from an economic point of view, it's been extremely valuable. But there are still an awful lot of social problems around it. There are lots of people, Cherokee people, that are hooked on gaming, and other people that will spend every last dime they have out there at that casino.
So do you think that if you had held to or they had listened to you, would that have been good? Because we have all these other tribes who did move on and got into casinos. So didn't you think it was an inevitable thing that had to happen, and you're saying, hey, I understand?
After I left, if I had been there for another year, I probably would have moved forward with it, okay. Just because, as what you say, it was becoming a major economic enterprise for Indian tribes.
You implemented a self-help for rural development, which became an example for other tribes or nations.
This town called Bell, Oklahoma, in Adair County. And I said, the dilemma is that they live in ramshackle houses most of them without indoor plumbing. If I go to the BIA under their BIA housing program, the repair program, I said, it doesn't help to put a bathroom in because they don't have running water. But if I go to Indian Health Service to get a water line put in, they won't put it in because they don't have facilities to hook up to. So there's, you got this government problem that you can't do what's rational, what would make sense. And so I said, we need to get water into the community, and we've got 16 miles of rural waters through some very tough country. So he said, well, let's go down and talk to them and see what the community would like to do. We did. We had a couple of meetings to just talk about the problem, and I explained to them why the tribe was not going to be able to come in and do this for them, or to build a water line for them, because we got money from Indian Health to do water lines in other areas. And I said, we just, the housing is such that we don't have anything to really hook up to. There may be an opportunity here to do a project if the community is willing to invest their time and effort to do it. We can get some material out of Phillips, some of the pipeline stuff. We'll hire a backhoe operator. But other than that, you would have to lay the line, and, bed it down, fill the hole, and all that. And they agreed to embark on the project. Well, then we get to the principles of self-help. And so, okay, we've got 16 miles. You have about, I think there are around 200 people in the community. We need a group of so many people for each 2 miles that are going to work this line. You can work any time. Most of the people were unemployed. Said you can work in the evenings or weekends. You have to keep up with the progress. You can't show up drunk. You got to be sober. You'll have some training to do, and you have to show up for that. And basically, we went through the whole skill set that they had developed for involving self-help, because a lot of people volunteer for things, but they don't really follow through. And then we needed somebody that would come in and take over that responsibility of learning the principles of self-help and applying them with that community. And I chose Wilma. And I said, Wilma Mankiller has, a history of social work and out in, of course, in Alcatraz and working with groups to motivate and what have you. So I said, I think she would be a good one to do. So I would put her with a lady named Jane Schautz, S-C-H-A-U-T-Z, I think. Jane was one of the leaders of the whole self-help program. So she came in to Bell, and she worked with Wilma and basically taught her all the, what she needed to know and to do. And Wilma took to it fairly quickly, and she was good with the people. And of course, her future husband, Charlie Soap, we had involved because Charlie was a Cherokee speaker, and most of these people down there spoke Cherokee. We managed to get through the project. It worked out very well. We were able to build those 16 miles of water line for a fraction of the cost that it would be if we had hired a contractor to come in and do it. And so I made the proposal then that any project that we did like that, whether it's housing, because we went on after that to build like manufactured housing in Bell. They put it up themselves, but it was panelized housing. And we made a project out of that with a dozen or so houses. And then every project we did involving community work, we required there be a portion of self-help involved with it.
Well, then that was an example for other tribes to follow.
It was, and we did work with a couple of tribes to give them information and how I went out and visited. I don't know how. The problem is with that, it is so much easier just hire a contractor, go in and do it. But the one thing that really stands out is in that community, we achieved not only a water line, we achieved employment. People learned a trade and they were able to apply it to the other rural water districts and get jobs. We saw a decrease in alcoholism. School attendance went up. I mean, all those social factors that you get out of achieving something yourself and doing it yourself, that's important.
Community who became closer together.
Very much so.
Right. So you were chief for 10 years.
I was.
So then you had been appointed Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs as part of the Department of Interior by President Ronald Reagan.
Yes.
So you're going to leave And then who do you ask to run for principal chief?
Well, in 1983, in 1981, I had cancer. I had lymphoma. I was treated at MD Anderson and successfully. My first election, as I said, was one with a plurality. The second one was 60+% of the vote. The third one, I had not intended to run. Wasn't necessarily because of health, but because by that time, by 85, I was pretty well cured, at least, I thought I was. However, by 1983, by 83, I'd finished all my treatment. Perry Wheeler was my deputy chief. And I had invited him to be my deputy chief back when I was first elected, 1975. Perry was, he was a nice guy. He was part of the old Ray Fine machine in Sequoyah County. And he was funeral homeowner down there. And about as close to the Gene's type of people you would find in Sequoyah County. Well, that didn't make a lot of difference to me because the tribe was doing things totally outside of state politics. Perry was effective when the one thing that happens in Indian country is people like to travel. There's always a meeting somewhere, National Congress of American Indians, this meeting, that. So I'd send Perry to those because I just didn't want to do it and didn't have time to do it. In 1982, when we were getting ready to set up for election, he decided to run against me. The word was that I was going to die and that they needed to start getting control before the election, and I could just see, I could see what's happened now, happening then. Because today the Cherokee Nation is simply an arm of the Democratic Party, and it's totally beholden to the Democratic Party, and not that that's good or bad, it's just that it's not Cherokee. And I could see it being taken over for political purposes outside of the Cherokee Nation. So I said, I think I'm going to run again. And I needed a running mate, so I asked Wilma if she would run with me, thinking that that was a good idea because she was heavily involved now in the self-help, community development, been around the area quite a bit, seemed to be well-liked, pretty intelligent, so I asked her to run with me. She thought about it for a few days and decided that she would accept and be on the ticket. I got holy hell from some of my best supporters that you can't have a woman running with you. No, a woman as chief, she could be chief of the tribe. You can't do that. This is awful. You don't want Wilma on the ticket with you. And I said, what are you talking about? I mean, I think she'd do a great job. And I guess it's my naivete. I've always been a strong supporter of women, and I just thought it makes sense. We had as bad campaign as I had in 1975. One of the programs that had come out of the Department of Agriculture was similar to commodities. They were giving free food to the tribes. I had put a hold on it until we had been able to research a little bit as to whether we wanted this. Well, Wheeler goes on television, has this big stack of food boxes, said, if Swimmer had signed off on it, you'd have free food today. Swimmer's this, Swimmer's that. And then the rumor, of course, circulated, well, you're going to die anyway, so, he's got this cancer. Why? You don't want to elect him. On the first ballot, I got 50.1 or 2%. Wilma didn't quite make it. And so she had a runoff, and I basically financed her runoff campaign, and she ultimately won. So then in 1985, of course, I had been asked by all three secretaries of Interior in the Reagan administration to go to Washington, and I turned them all down. And finally, Hodel was secretary in 1985. You know, he told me how important it was that I do my civic duty, and the president wants me to come to Washington and do this. And I said, well, I'm in the middle of my third term, and I don't feel good about leaving the tribe, and I'd certainly have to talk to Wilma to see if she's agreeable to assuming that responsibility. And then I told Margaret, I said, you know, it's a tough time for us because the boys were teenagers, and, you know, here she's practicing law, and they're in school, and I'd wind up in Washington most of the time. But I said, you need to go with me and talk to Hodel and listen to his spiel. And she did, and then she said, I don't see how you can turn him down. I said, they seem to really want you to come up here and do something. So thinking that maybe there was an opportunity to actually make a difference in Indian country, I took on the job and started. I was actually nominated in May or June and was put on hold by Senator Melcher of Montana because he wanted to have the Park Service give him $100,000 to do something up there, and they weren't going to do that, and so he put a hold on my nomination, which lasted for a couple of months, and it wasn't until October I was finally voted out and started work.
And so Wilma then went on to run.
And Wilma,
and she prevailed.
She was chief for 2 years, sought re-election twice after that, so she served 10 years as well.
And we've interviewed her on voicesofoklahoma.com, and people need to listen to that. She talks about the government relocation program, and which her family was dumped off in the red light district in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
But she gained a lot of experience, didn't she, as a result of that move that she brought back to Oklahoma?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I'm sure I have a real difference of opinion about the relocation program. I think it's the best thing that ever happened. It's really interesting that about half of the Native population took advantage of that and are still living in urban areas that they moved to and have had families and all that have grown up there. Hers was very similar to that. They moved there. It was voluntary. I mean, the government made it available. If you want to leave this godforsaken reservation, you can go to. We'll send you to Chicago. We'll send you to wherever. Pay your expenses, pay your housing, get training, and get you a job. And people said, sound like a good deal to me. And they left. For those that did, most of them, as far as I can tell, have been successful. You look at the people that are on those reservations today. It's awful. And
she doesn't speak as glowingly about it as you just have.
I would imagine being a part of it was different, but I don't know why her situation was so difficult, because the family seemed to do well out there. She got married. She married a fellow that was pretty wealthy. She did get involved in the Indian movement locally, but I don't know the circumstances that would have caused her the heartache she obviously suffered by moving, by her family moving there. I don't know if it was her mom or his dad, who it was that took up the opportunity to do that, what she gave up to go out there.
Prejudice against Native Americans. It's been there for some time. Would you agree?
It has, it is, and
still here today.
Still here today.
Has it increased or decreased over the last 20 years, 30 years?
It's decreased, but it's also localized. For instance, if you go to Pine Ridge in southwest South Dakota, it is the absolute worst conditions of any reservation. About 10,000 people live on that reservation, and about 9,900 of them are all alcoholic. They have nothing to do. The school systems on Indian reservations that are provided by the BIA are awful. You can't fight the bureaucracy. It's just you put government workers out there. Principals make, they are on the GS schedule. They make $150,000 a year. Superintendents or SES, they might make $200,000 a year. Teachers do well, but they're not very competent. They just don't care, and many of the people on the reservation, the parents of the kids, if they want their kids to get an education, they send them to public school. And nearly every BIA school has a public school within a few miles of it. But kids who drop out of the public school go to the BIA school. And there are just lots of problems. But at places like Pine Ridge, there's just nothing to do. They've never had the leadership that would give them the opportunity to really do something. I mean, they get money, they have their own law enforcement, and they get money for housing. And yeah, I've been to housing areas on reservations. This is one of the things we had to fight too. The government decides that it's a lot better if you can get 5 acres of land and build 20 houses on it. It's more economical. So you do that, and next thing you know, you've got this family moving from here and this family over here. They don't get along. And the next thing you know, it's just a rural ghetto. And then a few years later, the windows are out, doors broken, places are falling down. There's been very little effort to engage tribal members in what they can do, what they need to do, and how to do it. And the leadership is very poor. So nobody cares who gets elected. You can elect the proverbial brother-in-law, because if they screw up, the BIA will come in and take it over and make it right. So
we should point out, when you keep saying BIA, that's the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Prejudice, I want to go back to Wilma again, because when she became principal chief, she had that backlash from a largely male council against her, and she talks about that. So she had that to contend with.
That's because she's a woman.
Exactly. Right.
Ridiculous.
And so she had to make some, as I recall her saying, probably make some decisions early on to show them, I can make these decisions and they're going to stand.
Yeah, I think so. An interesting side note, when I went to the Bureau in 85, by mid-86, I would hear from people back here that had said that, well, Swimmer's still running the tribe, He tells Wilma what to do. They're pretty much in communication. And the fact is, I never did. Never. When I went to Washington, I couldn't do anything for or with the tribe just because of the ethics issue, but I never had any contact with her. I really didn't know, other than the gaming issue, I didn't know of any major. The thing I did know, and maybe this is where it came from, we had a plan for the health care. We knew where we wanted clinics and what we wanted. And that plan was about halfway done when I left, and she continued it. And we had some educational initiatives and kept going. So about the only thing that was really different was the gaming. And that grew as a business more than any other business.
You know, as much as being a female worked against her, being a female also helped her because she became a celebrated person because she was female.
Female Indian with the name of Mankiller.
Right. And she was a first principal chief, first female principal chief. So being a female made her a star.
And my only regret about that was that I felt in her last term, second term, full term, that she was far more involved in the women's movement than she was in the tribe.
Okay.
She and Gloria Steinem became best friends. She spent an awful lot of time in New York and working on women's issues, which is fine. I mean, because she had that persona, and she had good publicity for it.
So she's working women's issues, but not working Cherokee issues? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, she wasn't paying that much attention, and that's what part of, I think, what caused the debacle in 92 when Joe Byrd got elected. She had promoted a fellow to be her successor as chief. He was a nice guy, probably would have done a good job, but she wasn't paying enough attention to it, and they got into a runoff, Joe Byrd and this guy, and then it turned out that he had he'd been arrested for an assault or something back in his younger days, had been expunged from the record. The opposition in the tribe at the time took it up as an issue, and the tribal court said, well, the Constitution says if you've ever been convicted, even though it's been expunged, and so they ruled him out at the runoff. And Joe Byrd takes over as chief. And that was a disaster. Those 4 years were awful.
Well, let me ask you, what does a federally recognized tribe mean? Federally recognized. Does that mean that all nations or tribes are not federally recognized?
Well, yes. Federal recognition is a term of art that in order to have all the trappings of an Indian tribe, sovereignty and that sort of thing, you have to be federally recognized. That means the United States government has to recognize you as an Indian tribe. There are dozens and dozens of groups that call themselves tribes, and some are state recognized, but not federally recognized. You have a lot in Virginia. You have, I bet there are 30 at least Cherokee tribes. Cherokee tribe of Tennessee, the Cherokee band in Georgia, the Cherokee this, the Cherokee that, and they're all listed as tribes, but they're not recognized as federal, under the federal jurisdiction. The federal government has the full authority over an Indian tribe. The federal government can create or they can dissolve an Indian tribe. There are two ways to become a federally recognized tribe, and one is through the recognition process of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where you go through a lengthy review for the tribe as far as do they still have language, have they been consistent in meetings, get-togethers, is there a tribal role, do you have all the trappings of an actual government that have continued for a certain period of time. So the Bureau can say this group should be an Indian tribe and we'll recognize it. The other way is through an act of Congress. The act of Congress, as I said, they can create or they can dissolve. So they can actually, you can go the political route and say, you know, the BIA is off the charts. We know we're a tribe. We know we've done this. We want you, Mr. Congressman, to introduce a bill to recognize us. That's how the Pequots got recognized, because the Pequots basically disappeared a couple hundred years ago. There were allegedly a couple of Pequot descendants of the original Pequot. They applied, they went to Congress and asked for recognition. They got recognition. And of course, the outcome was the largest casino in the world for a while. They built the Pequot Casino in Connecticut. Chickasaws now have the largest casino floor in the world, gaming floor. But anyway, that in our case, the only way we were able to get a constitution was both with the help of Keeler and the Bureau, because I went to Washington, I'd made the promise, and I said, we'll bring a constitution forward. Well, I didn't have any authority to do that. There was nothing in the law, because the '06 law basically dissolved us from the government. And I proposed a constitution to the Secretary of Interior, and I said, we want to get organized. We didn't have to get recognized because we were historically recognized as an Indian tribe and had not been terminated in '06 due to that particular phrase. We were the first tribe of the five then who managed to do that. We convinced Secretary Clippy, I think, that he should sign off on our Constitution. Well, that sort of allowed the other four tribes to come in and do the same thing. And part of it because before that, we were not entitled to a lot of services from the federal government providing services to Indian tribes because we were not organized.
So name the other four tribes.
Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole.
Okay, talk about sovereignty, a self-governing state. Can tribes buy land and make it sovereign?
Yes, and they do that by getting the federal government to agree to accept the title to the land, and they hold it in trust for the particular tribe. So if the Cherokee tribe, as they did, they go buy a piece of land, they deed that over to the U.S. government with the government's permission, and then the government holds it in trust for them. And they're allowed to do whatever activities they'd like to do on that land up to a point. But everything they do is regulated by the government. Even on the gaming, the National Indian Gaming Commission has some say about how the tribe operates its gaming business.
You were 40 years old, and you thought the Bureau of Indian Affairs should go away to work yourself out of a job. You wanted to remove Washington from the equation. And a quote here, as long as the tribes look to the federal government to solve their problem, the problems will always be there. So the National Congress of American Indians, one of the largest and oldest Indian advocacy organizations, attacked you for your reckless effort to pull the government out of Indian affairs. Blame Indian problems on, you said blame Indian problems on too much government help. Am I characterizing all that you faced?
That's correct. That was where the opposition came from. NCAI, National Congress of American Indians, and other Indian advocates out there disagreed wholeheartedly with me on that. I made the statement too when I met with the BIA employees, and I said the best thing you can do is work yourself out of a job. And I said, because those jobs need to be on the reservation, you don't need to be up here telling people how to live out there on those reservations. We need to change our attitude. And that didn't go over very well. And that's because of, well, a lot of things, but the most valuable jobs on an Indian reservation are those that are descendant from the federal government. You're the agency superintendent. You're the person who is in the Indian Education Office. You're the social workers. You're this, you're that. I mean, they're all, that's money that comes out in total. By the time, well, within the last 10 years, the budget for Indian country from all the federal agencies is about $18 billion. There are 1.5 million Indians.
Wow.
And you can spend a whole lot of money doing nothing.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening. And I still advocate it today. I told this administration, I was asked if I was interested, and I said, no, I don't want to go back. And I said, until you can get a resolution that tribes are truly sovereign, that tribes actually are sovereign entities, and maybe use the Puerto Rico model, maybe use the Washington, D.C. model. They are independent governments, and they're, give them a chunk of money and say, that's it. Now, you run your government. You run your schools. You run your social programs, your housing programs. You take the responsibility, and the leadership of the tribe then is responsible for what happens instead of being able to blame some bureaucrat back in Washington. And I contend that this attitude, that this whole idea that tribes have to be controlled, that they have to, that even their land, as I said, is in trust so that the government decides how they're going to use it and how they're going to invest their money. The last administration paid out $3 billion to Indian tribes for alleged wrongs against their reservation. And just a quick story. One example of this on the reservation out in Oregon. Everyone, they took a contract to manage their land. So under self-governance, as we called it when I introduced it in 1987 or 88, I said, we have self-determination where you can contract a program from the Bureau and run it yourself. I said, true self-governance is you take the money and you develop the program you want instead of taking a program from because I used to get money all the time for stuff that we didn't need. But that's the only way you could get money. You had to say, okay, I'll apply for that, and I'll apply for that. You kept getting the money. Well, at the Warm Springs tribe, they had contracted to run their reservation. They sued the government and got $100 million because after about 5 or 10 years, whatever it was, the reservation lands had been grazed down to the nub. Every person on that reservation has a horse. And they had horses all in the pasture. Well, that was their responsibility. But do you think any tribal leader is going to go out and take somebody's horse away from them when they're overgrazing the land? No, instead they sue the government for allowing it to happen. And yet they operated under a contract to do it themselves. Good friend of mine, Pat Ragsdale, was in the BIA, and he went out to Navajo one time and told them they had to decrease their sheep population because they were overgrazing, and they ran him out of the reservation, threatened him.
You seem like we can blame Washington and blame tribes both. They're all complicit in this. Is that fair to say?
Well, yeah, at this point it is, because the tribes get this money, and they can, and it's little dictatorships. The tribal governments are too often corrupt, and the money doesn't get down to the people, and yet they get it with impunity because nobody in Washington wants to go out and. I mean, you can ask the FBI, Every major crime on a reservation is a federal crime. The only crimes that the local reservation police force can handle are misdemeanors. Well, I will promise you that there are very few FBI agents that want to go out and do the work to process a rape or a murder or an armed robbery or anything else on a reservation. They just don't want to do it. They won't do it. And then when you think about taking it into federal court, and that's what's going on in this county right now because of the Creek decision that came out of the 10th Circuit and said that the Creek Nation was never disestablished and that the territory of the Creek Nation, every Indian in it, if they commit a crime, has to go to federal court instead of state court. And if that ruling holds up, that's going to change the whole nature of tribes and the state of Oklahoma.
So then, like on
the relationship
reservations, some of these crimes would go on prosecuted.
Most of them do.
You could have rapes, murders,
yes,
and they're
yes.
not.
Sometimes the tribes will arrest someone for a murder and charge them with a simple assault just so they can put them in jail for 2 years because they can't get the Fed to prosecute the murder.
Wow.
I mean, it's just ridiculous. That's why they need to have law enforcement power on the reservation. And they ought to have it, let the tribe run the law enforcement, the courts, and most of the tribes now, most of them are fairly sophisticated in that. I mean, our court down in Tahlequah is pretty good as far as...
So they now can prosecute their cases. It doesn't have to be federal.
No, it's still federal if it's an Indian committing a crime on restricted land.
So quickly then, to show how much Washington valued you, 2001, President Bush named you as Director of the American Indian Trust Transition. 2003, you were named Special Trust for American Indians, first American Indian to hold that position. Trust for more than 400,000 Indians and 500 Indian tribes. All that happened. The trust's assets consisted of $3.5 billion, 55,000 acres of land with an annual income of approximately $800 million. It's a whole lot of money to be managing, isn't it? And
well,
I'm sorry to jump in, but
no, it is.
Do you think that some of this prejudice against Native Americans comes from some of this, what I just talked about? They see all this money that maybe should go to the tribe or shouldn't go to the tribe?
I don't think so. I don't think that the prejudice is in that nature. I think it's just the same thing you see with black. You know, with African American, you still have the prejudice, and you know, I hate to use the anecdote, but I'll tell you one thing that really took me back. I couldn't imagine. When I was with the bank in Tahlequah as president of the bank, Peter and I, Manhart, had given some thought because we were always known as the Bank of the Cherokees, and we had the Cherokee language out there. And we said, well, maybe we ought to change, we were talking at a board meeting, so maybe we ought to change the name of the bank to Bank of the Cherokees. And one of the board members said, well, why don't you just call it Nigger National?
Wow.
And this was Tahlequah in 1979, probably, 70 or 80. I mean, and if you go up, you know, on reservation, like the one I talked about, the Pine Ridge, or really any of the Sioux reservations, they really can't go into town very often. I mean, there's really still today lots of prejudice up there. There's not as much in Oklahoma, and that's because we're assimilated. I mean, you see me walk down the street, nobody says, well, there goes an Indian.
No.
They don't do that because we're so assimilated, so mixed up.
Well, I grew up in North Dakota, and I knew about the Sioux, and I knew about reservations. So as a young boy growing up, we did not have a very high opinion of Native Americans. We thought they were drunk most of the time, and they were lazy and didn't work, and they lived on reservations. That's what they thought. And so I held that for a long time. didn't think about Native Americans for a long time in Omaha, but I came here to Oklahoma, then my whole attitude changed. And I high respect to the point where I've said, I wish I had some Cherokee blood in me. I mean, that's how that all changed. So we here in Oklahoma respect and are respecting and holding him in higher regard.
Until you get to Western Oklahoma.
Yes, and I also know elected officials today who are very much anti-Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes out in their speech and all that. And I don't know.
Caricatures of Indian people,
Yeah.
you know. And
The Trump administration, here we are in 2018, and Native Americans. Is this a good fit?
not necessarily. It could be, though, if, you know, he seems to be interested in sort of tearing everything up and then trying to rebuild it. If someone were willing to go that next step and change the relationship of the federal government to Indian tribes and actually give tribes the responsibility of being sovereign entities, that would be good. But you won't get Congress to do that. Congress' attitude is that we keep throwing the money out there and I don't have to worry about it. We only got 1.5 million people, maybe it's 1 3/4 now. There's only maybe 2 or 3 congressional offices that could be affected by the Indian vote. We're so scattered that there's no way of influencing, that vote.
Yeah.
Having people like Mark Wayne up there, I think, is good. Tom Coe is, and Tom Coe's been great for
right.
the tribes.
And he's Native American, Tom Coe.
He's Chickasaw, and he's done a lot to help build Anatomy down there.
What about the customs and the culture? I think Wilma Mankiller thought that in this Indian Removal Act, they were trying to destroy the culture of the tribes, the nations. I don't know if that's true or not, but Native Americans are marrying non-Indians, and so do you fear that the customs of, say, the Cherokees is just being washed away?
I think that's a natural thing that happens with people. It's how you become acculturated, and is there a reason why you should not? I don't know. I don't know why there would be. I enjoy going down to the stomp grounds and even participating in their socials down there. The language is never going to come back as a readily used language. It's great, I think, for kids who want to take it, or you take it as a foreign language, but there's no one to speak to, so it's not used commercially. So the languages of the tribes, I think, is an educational thing. That's fine. Do what you can and keep kids interested in it. And I'm sure that the opportunity that was given for the relocation had part of that in mind, that we need to get these people off reservations, and if we can incentivize them to move, then it's in our best interest and their best interest too. But it's like any other. As people become assimilated, you're going to intermarry. Our kids are an 8th Cherokee now. We have Cherokees on the road that are 1/4000th and something because we don't have a blood quantum. I've never thought that blood quantum made anyone Indian or non-Indian. It was a matter of, your government. Do you belong to a tribe? And Cherokees do because they have an interest in that. I just think that's a natural occurrence that happens whether you, as far as assimilation.
But it's important, isn't it, to impress on these young Native Americans the importance of their history.
Yes, and they should read the history. I just finished a new book that came out on Cherokee, written about Cherokee history, and it's interesting because it has a whole different light on the Ridge and Ross factions and whether Ross was right in trying to stay in Georgia. And the book, the author tends to say that was not a good idea. You know, it was inevitable that Georgia was going to kick out the Cherokees and that Andrew Jackson was going to back them. So why not pick up and move when it's timely instead of wait till the soldiers come in and say, time's up, and then you have the Trail of Tears and all that. Where Stan Wadey and that group came over early, started setting up their settlements in western Arkansas, and were, you know, doing fairly well already. And Ross was holding the full-bloods back. But if you look at Indian country and compare it to Oklahoma, what has assimilation done in Oklahoma? Even though we have 39 tribes, our alcoholism rate is no different than it is for the general population. You don't have that concentration of tribal people in an area where, you know, you have that kind of a problem. I think it helps to have the integration and assimilation with the general public. And I think that's why the tribes in Oklahoma are doing so well. They don't have, I asked Bill Anatoly Chickasaw, I said, when's the last time that you had to meet with the BIA on something? He said, I don't even remember.
The Bureau of...
We run our own shop. We do, you know, they're about as independent as you get.
So you're saying if they were all, the alcoholism rate is greater when they're all grouped together, and it reduces when they become assimilated into the general population.
If you live on the reservation, the consequences of it are that there's very little to do and not much opportunity, that you tend to fall into those kinds of problems, more so than if you are part of the general public. It's not as, you're not as likely to succumb to that kind of thing as you might be otherwise.
Young people listening to this, students are using the website, professors are using it. You give advice for young people, say, coming out of college, maybe some to Native Americans, however you choose, but what would you say?
Well, I think it's really important to young people today to get involved in their government, both state, local, and federal. We're seeing some malaise in that regard. They say the millennials aren't really very interested in democracy anymore. And I think that's a huge mistake. I think history is extremely important for young people to learn, to go back and look at where we came from and what we've accomplished in this country. For Indian folks, I do suggest that they get in touch with their tribe and learn what they're doing and go to work for them if they can, because they are unique in that they have reasons to offer their services to their tribe, and I think that's a good thing for Indian people to do. And there are quite a few opportunities, more so today than really there have ever been, to get involved with the tribe and do things. But as far as young people are concerned, the world is theirs. The opportunities today abound. I mean, there's no limit. And whether it's technology or whether it's being a laborer out here, so many opportunities that we have not had before and that are available going forward, and they should take advantage of it.
We've talked about your shyness when you were young. You've reflected on your life today and you look back on all the accomplishments and major leadership roles that you played, to think that I was once this shy little boy and I've been able to accomplish what I've accomplished.
sometimes I feel like Forrest Gump. I don't know. I never went into this life thinking I was going to do any of these things. We always knew about our Indian heritage, but we never really got that excited about it. We go to Locust Grove periodically to see other relatives over there. That's where our allotment was. But I never had an idea of becoming an Indian chief. I never thought about working for 2 presidents, being called to Washington. I never, these things happened because of other things that happened. It was not something that I strived for. I mean, some people go into business and decide they want to be a multimillionaire and head of their company. I just started out wanting to practice law, and was somewhat successful at doing what I was doing, and then one thing led to another. It was funny because 2 years before, in 1990 or 91, we used to go to Tahlequah and to Tin Killer. And one day, Margaret and I were walking around the campus at Northeastern, and we said, wouldn't this be a great place to live if you can make a living? 2 years later, I'm in Tahlequah.
Yeah.
And I had no ambition at that time of going to Tahlequah for anything. So life happens, and you just you accept the consequences and take part in it. Make it what you can, and go forward.
Some of our interviews, they knew at a very early age what they wanted to be.
I could imagine.
Singers, business people. They knew at 5, 6, and 7 years old what they wanted to do. Governor George Nye, when he was 12, 13 years old, said he'd be governor of Oklahoma. They knew. You didn't know.
No, I didn't.
But then also, as you look back, you were laying groundwork for the next position that you were to take on. Don't you think? You find yourself, wow, I was preparing myself for this, and I didn't even know it.
Well, I guess I was, and in a way it worked out. The reason I became assistant secretary is because I basically was lobbying the Department of Interior for 3 years before that to get some satisfaction out of the Arkansas riverbed that the court said we owned. And in visiting with the various secretaries, I came to their attention. They said, well, we need you to come up here. You know something about, you know what you want to do with Indian country, and we need somebody like, well, one of the solicitors was Gail Norton. I didn't work with her very much, but I knew her. When the big issue, the huge lawsuit came up involving Cobell, where an individual of the Blackfeet tribe sued the government for $180 billion. I got a call from Gail in 1971, and she said, I was appointed secretary 3 months ago, and now Judge Lamberth is threatening to hold me in contempt of court because I haven't already solved this trust problem with all of these individual Indian people that we were being sued. And so I don't know anything about it, and I'm told that you did some work on it when you're the assistant secretary, and that was 10 years before.
Yeah.
So she calls up and says, can you come up and help us? And I said, yeah, I'll come up and talk to you about it. And the next thing I know, we want you here. So things happen like that. As you say, you can be prepared for it, but I wasn't expecting to go back to Washington in 2001, and then I didn't know how long I'd be there, and I stayed for the whole term. And we did get the trust done. We got it straightened out so people could actually get an account statement showing what they owned and how much money they had and where it came from. I mean, it was a sad situation. I could understand why they were suing the government, because people had no idea. All their land is held in trust and managed by the BIA, and so people weren't keeping records and didn't know, where the money was coming from. Lots of oil and gas money, big dollars.
I can say that you had a stellar reputation because of integrity. You were smart, and you had sound judgment. And so people see that, and they say, here's a man we can trust. And so that's why you got where you did, and I will tell you that.
Well, I appreciate that. I did want to run for Congress, and I started to when we did a poll. This was when Kathy Keating was running. The poll showed that she had 97% approval rating and about 98% name recognition. Of course, Frank was governor, and I did one on me, and it was about 60, 40, somewhere in there. I mean, it was enough that I could have run. I decided when I was also, when Inhofe was first elected, we had an open seat. I had talked about running for Senate, and he offered me a ride from the airport into D.C. one time, and we got to talking about it and said, I hear you might be thinking about running. And I said, well, I considered it. And he said, well, I don't know, with Margaret being head of Planned Parenthood and having a gay son, if that's a good idea. And I thought, well, you can overcome some of those things, but why do you want to go through it? And I knew they'd come up. I knew this would be, and the other thing is, if you're going to run from Tulsa, you've got the South Tulsa contingency, and you just cannot overcome those social issues if you're not pretty far right. I mean, you just look at Hearn and Coleman and all. I mean, they pledge fealty to the president. They pledge fealty to anti-abortion and the evangelicalism, and I can't go there.
Yeah.
I cannot make myself say something that I just firmly don't believe.
And now you're referring to the present election, which
President
began just
election.
yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
and you're referring to the very, very right wing that is seeming to control the elections.
Yeah, and especially in Tulsa. And it didn't used to be that way. Of course, times have changed. I was a big fan and friend of Jim Jones, and he always had a challenging election running as a Democrat from Tulsa. And I was sorry to see him get that seat up and run for Senate, because he could still be in there if he wanted to be.
Right.
We've been lifelong, Henry Bowman got me into the Republican Party back just out of college, and I wanted to work for him, and I served in different activities. He would appoint me to do something or other, and I always admired him. He was a great man. When we went to build the new Indian hospital, I couldn't get support from the administration, and so I went to Bellman, and Bellman didn't want to support it either, because he said, I don't like single-purpose facilities. I don't even like the VA. If you're going to have government spend the money, it ought to be for everybody. He said, you go back to Tahlequah and you get those rednecks to work with the Indians to come up with a solution on how we can make this a better deal for everybody. And I said, okay, I'll do it. One of the things that came out of that is today the best optometry school in the United States.
Where is it?
Tahlequah.
Oh, yeah.
And not only that, we worked out ways with the local hospital to share services and several things. And I went back to him and told him that there's what we've done. And he went to work and got us $18 million appropriated to build that hospital.
If we had several Henry Bellmans today, we really needed them. And we also have Henry Bellman's interview on voicesofoklahoma.com. I just want to thank you, Ross, for today. I don't know what I was to expect. I knew you'd be a good talker, but this was really wonderful. And thank you for committing time, because future generations will be listening to this and students will listen to it as well. So thank you for your service. to the state, to the tribe, and Washington, D.C., all that. We appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you, John, and I think you are doing a great service to capture some of this information from people around the state. That's the kind of thing that young people need to know about, need to hear, and I think that you've embarked on something that I guess started as kind of a hobby, but I think you're doing a great job with it. Not just because you chose to interview me, but because who all you have interviewed. I mean, I'd love to listen to Henry's. There's a statesman, just ultimate statesman.
Well, thank you, Ross. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
You have been listening to the Voices of Oklahoma podcast. Stories taken from the oral history website, voicesofoklahoma.com. At the website, you will discover an array of storytellers. Many you will know. Some will be new to you, but all will be worth your time. This work depends on listeners like you, who are interested in learning about the great people of Oklahoma. Our website provides an opportunity to donate to this 501c3 project, which preserves Oklahoma history, one voice at a time. voicesofoklahoma.com.